Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we are going to be talking about the best, most useful, most meta champions in the game right now. It is going to be the 20 best 7-star champions in MCOC in January of 2025. So obviously, as always, the standard disclaimers. So what you're going to see in this video is obviously a mixture of my own personal views and current game relevance and trends. These are not necessarily the best champions on paper judged by their abilities or the amount of utility. This is quite literally the list of champions that players go to when losing matters, when there are competitive scenarios, when there are challenge modes to do, and when there are, alliance wars, battlegrounds, so on and so forth. That is absolutely not to say that there aren't a whole bunch of other champions that are specifically better for something like questing or incursion or something like that. However, every single champion in this list, just about, unless they are there for their defensive prowess, are also extremely capable in just about any and every other area of the game. Ultimately, these lists are here to help people choose which champions to invest their most precious rank-up materials, most precious in-game items such as Awakening Gems and 6 Stones, and that is also part of the reason why we do not see 6 stars in these lists anymore. There will be a separate list for the best 6 stars in the game, or the best champions that do not exist as 7 stars in the game. Call it as you will, but for now we're only looking at champions that are out as 7 stars and that are meta present, that we do see a lot of people use often, and perhaps more specifically by the most capable, knowledgeable and skilled players in the game as well. So we're going to start. Oh, what did I press there by accident? El accidente. There you go, my bad. So we are gonna start with spot number 20, and spot number 20 I'm gonna give Stark Enhanced Spider-Man. Now there is one reason only really why Stark Enhanced Spider-Man is not much higher on this list, is because pretty much the entirety of his renaissance is battlegrounds. Like, objectively, you do not necessarily want to use him as a questing champion, because you do not want to do the whole wind up getting his charges up thing when you can use somebody that's much, quicker and straightforward. He's not the tankiest champion, so there's not a lot of room for error. He does require, fairly significant skill expression. You do see Starkey used here and there in Alliance Wars, although not that much. And in general, he, thrives in battlegrounds. That's effectively what the Stark Enhanced Spider-Man is. He is one of the best battlegrounds attackers in the game, specifically. And that is just enough to kind of land him on this list. Every other champion here will ultimately have, more or other uses than a single game mode. Again, perhaps with the exception of the defensive champions who are primarily there for Alliance War and battlegrounds. However, obviously this game has way more capable attackers than the defenders do. That said though, Stark Enhanced Spider-Man definitely gives a ton of value to any and all more serious battlegrounds players. Obviously there are plenty of people who just enjoy him as a champion, as there are, with any champion. I do want to try to make this video relatively short, so long story short, here you go. One of the best battlegrounds attackers, fairly nonchalant just about everywhere else, or less than present, let's say. Let's move on spot number 19, and that is going to go to Venom. Now, Venom is a champion that, again, regained his popularity with the release of 7 stars and the relics. Venom paired with the Venom relic, which is a huge asterisk here and a requirement for him to perform his best. You do want to have a Venom relic for your Venom, making him significantly more dangerous. But ultimately, he is somewhat a typical cosmic champion as well. But for the most part, he is nuke in battlegrounds. He is perfectly capable of handling a ton of questing scenarios. He does have some useful bits of utility against tech champions specifically, but he goes immune to power control. And yeah, obviously he destroys all the Spider-Verse champions, or almost all of them. a bit RNG reliant, very little defensive value aside from his character model and the AI when it can kind of catch you, but realistically not many defensive abilities. Overall though, definitely a champion in the Cosmic class that has kind of made quite a bit for himself out of very little, I would say. That relic and being available quickly as a 7-star gave him a ton of popularity that he still lives on and feeds on today, and ultimately is one of the better Cosmic champions currently available as 7 stars. And that will land him in spot number 19 for me. Spot number 18, I'm going to place Juggernaut, and I know that's quite low, and I do have reasoning for my madness. Before anybody jumps on me, I absolutely love Juggernaut. He is a champion that I love to use frequently just because how quickly he nukes through side events, monthly quests, and stuff like that. There are times when you can use Juggy in Alliance Wars as well, but it's not that often. He's solid incursion champion actually, but realistically Juggernaut's popular because of being an absolute nuke in Battlegrounds. Problem with Juggernaut is that either he works and then he is one of the best, or he doesn't, and then he's completely useless. He has very little defensive value, basically none. But yeah. And some people would say, doesn't that mean that Starkhand Spider-Man should be kind of higher above? Because objectively, you could say that Starkhand Spider-Man works in more metas than Juggernaut does, because it is easier to stop Juggernaut. Effectively, if you limit the damage heavily with something like Safeguard, Juggy doesn't work as much. If you have any debuffs placed on you that you cannot avoid, Juggy will not work. But at the same time, he's such a surefire, almost an out-of-win offensively when being used, in addition to the fact that Juggernaut is actually much more compatible with rest of the game and popular there, because he's genuinely one of the kind of quicker, easier, brain-dead questing champions as well. My favorite champion of the game, just about. I love that guy. He is again, exactly what the Mystic class needed to kind of get revitalized and push higher above a while ago, and he delivers. He is absolutely fantastic whenever he does work. He also happens to be quite lucky when he does, do plenty of the matchups that you wouldn't necessarily expect from the Mystic champion, and that definitely works in his favor. Alright, moving on, spot number 17, and that is going to be Prowler. Now, Prowler definitely has the potential to climb even higher. He's still a relatively new champion to the game, as we all know. He came out in 2024. And the fact is that he's one of the better tech champions currently in the game. And it's actually, fairly interesting because he doesn't have that much going on for him. He does require very good control of the fight, I would say. But ultimately, when you do get comfortable using Prowler, he just seems to be one of those champions that is currently doing whatever a tech champion should. And he's definitely one of the more visible tech champions in the game, across the game, be that Alliance War, be that Battlegrounds, be that, Eternity of Pain type of fights, and so on and so forth. Again, very little defensive value, primarily an attacker, but it is quite interesting to see a champion like Prowler, where you do want your opponent throw a special attack with as much power above water power in order to generate your furies. He obviously is a domino counter, which is like a huge plus for a tech champion, almost a must. Double immunities to bleed and incinerate, and he can provide evades with his mediums. He can place falters on opponent. An interesting champion. The one thing that does tick me off about Prowler quite a bit is that his entire damage is physical. It's based around physical. He doesn't crit, and he deals, physical bursts of damage. And then he's borderline required to land that incinerate in order to get his max damage. One of the bigger weaknesses of the Prowler, I would say, is just this part specifically, because you are forced to alternate your rotations in plenty of matchups, even or especially against mutants who are either incinerate immune or punish you for being incinerated, and this just kind of doesn't make sense to me. But overall, still a fantastic tech champion that I'm very, very envious of people who have him as a 7-star. I unfortunately do not. I have maxed out my 6-star Ascended and still get plenty of use for him, but he is also one of those champions that you do want to have ranked up as high as possible, because his damage in general is not necessarily the top of the peak, so you do want him as high rank as possible. He's not the best champ at punching up in between the ranks. Right, after Prowler, we're going to go into Count Nefaria for now. He's another champion that's very recent, that is one of the more popular champions from the previous year, that has a ton of utility, that effectively borderline made the leader obsolete. Has some defensive capabilities as well as obviously offensive ones. In specific metas, he can be an absolute monster. There are some very weird interactions that we recently saw with Matador. Obviously, he's immune to Power Steal and Bleed effect, as well as 90% resistant to Shock and Incinerate. So, you know, that in itself is kind of like very solid makings for a good base in the champion. Then he controls opponent's power and regen, which is what you'd kind of expect from a science champion. He has his auto-evade mechanic to punish opponents and get easy intercepts. He has vulnerability and has access to passive furies, and also if need be incinerate, even though it's not necessarily a core of his kit. But overall, a very good champion that has, you know, a lot of room to grow, in my opinion. I have previously talked about how I believe unless Kabam balances him, he will have this sword of Damocles always hanging around his head, which is called Unfazed Mastery, which is extremely surprising given how much Kabam loves messing with masteries recently, which I absolutely hate, by the way. Just leave our masteries alone. But, you know, switching off willpower, switching off dexterities, switching off just about any mastery they want these days for any random champion. They could not do that for this guy and, you know, let him bypass Unfazed. And whilst it is not an issue, well, he's not completely, you know, meta-dominant mainstay champion, but as soon as he will become, and, you know, to a fairly big degree even right now in kind of like competitive scenarios, he is getting messed by that Unfazed. And with Unfazed, you do lose quite a bit of speed on Nefaria, which is a major issue. But overall, very solid addition to the game. Another one of the few champions in this list that I do not have as a 7-star, have as a 6-star, but absolutely wish I would. Right. Now, spot number 15 is going to go to Shocker. Shocker arrived in the game extremely underwhelming and then got tuned up, and that kind of turned just about everything around for Shocker. And again, Shocker does have solid amount of defensive value, especially in some metas. He can be quite big of a problem. You know, shortened stun durations, making it inconsistent when punishing Shocker, and then his ability to go unblockable on dashes, and you having to consistently keep an eye on his charges, auto-blocking special attacks. All that stuff is quite important and valuable. And then he just nukes. You know, you do get your rotation done, drop that heavy attack, and he can kill just about everything that he works on. Obviously, avoiding crits is quite a big part. There is quite a bit of value being given to a single hit of a massive damage, allowing you to bypass a ton of abilities as well. For instance, you know, when opponents, they have some sort of evade or abilities when they activate, when opponents at like 20% or less power and so on and so forth. That immediately gets rid of all that. And overall, definitely, you know, a solid buff for a champion. I wouldn't say a solid, you know, arrival to MCOC. But right now, Shocker is one of the better tech champions and a very versatile champ to have at your disposal. Now let's move on. We do have Spider-Ham, a little piggy that could. Champion from 2020 that kind of blossomed recently. Even a year ago when I placed Spider-Ham in Science Top 10, I got quite a lot of pushback. But now, you know, unironically, Spider-Ham is kind of like a staple Science champion that we do see just about everywhere. Power Sting, it has gotten more valuable over time, I even would say, especially given the fact that how few Power Sting champions we have and how much Power Sting as a damage type can bypass. Again, be that all safeguards, be that immunities and resistances, so and so forth. There are very few champions that can effectively mitigate or ignore the Power Sting damage. That definitely works in his favor. He does have defensive value in specific matchups and specific metas. I wouldn't say that he's like the best generic defender, and if opponent does have like a solid counter, then he's gonna go down quite quick. But it's very interesting where in order to counter Spider-Ham, it almost doesn't even matter as much which class champions you use. It's more so matters what damage rotations they have and whether you can quickly dump your power. And I find it quite fascinating how his defensive kit comes into play so much later after him being released. And yeah, other than that, just the biggest power sting damage champion that we have. He's quite nuky in short medium fights. Again, it takes a bit of getting used to, but once you do that, extremely capable little piggy. Let's move on to spot number 13, and I'm going to give that to Warlock. Now again, that could be an argument, but Warlock has never been the flashiest champion in the game aside from his character model and animations that I still find extremely cool and satisfying when I use. He does not have the highest amount of damage in generic situations. That goes drastically up with attack modifiers such as Recall Mastery's boosts and so on and so forth. Synergizes extremely well with tech powerback boosts for Alliance War purposes. But the reason he is still here is just because he does stuff and he works, and he has arguably the best, heal and power control in the game. So one of the very few champions, if opponent has willpower active, that you can make sure your opponent never reaches or is able to throw a special attack in a fight. And that still presents an insane amount of utility. Obviously, there are ways to counter that, but overall, the amount of fights that he can do is quite ridiculous, and the amount of metas that he works. And again, I always describe Warlock as a champion that just happens to have the right immunities, so bleed, poison, cold snap as being robot. A champion that just happens to have access to easy bleeds. A champion that just happens to have a single hit heavy attack, thus giving you a legitimate way to bypass evades as long as you can parry and deal decent amount of damage just by parry heavy. A champion that happens to have access to shock if need be, that has a great power control, has a regen control, has armor break, and that has effectively been just about everything for Warlock. He works in some of the highest amount of cases compared to just about any other champion. There are very few more champions in a game that will work under more different conditions and metas, I would say. Obviously, he has his weaknesses, but on the bright side, he does have a defensive utility too under the right set of conditions. He's not generically the best defender. There are ways how to get around it, but he can at the very least be a defensive nuisance if opponents can't get rid of his armor up and do not have a way to dot him quickly down on non-contact attacks. So as long as his defensive kit can work even slightly, he can, be a solid defender. In some circumstances, he can be a crazy defender that everybody should be very afraid. But overall, a very solid, balanced champion. I think one of the most successful additions to the game just about ever. He's 5-6 years old now, 5 and some, and still just about as relevant as ever. So let's move on. Domino, and again, a champion with quite an interesting life cycle, because Domino came out, she was all the rage, people loved using her with Red Hulk and Massacre synergy to spam those heavy attack incinerates, and then she could do some crazy bleeds, and then different game modes got more important, like Alliance War and so on and so forth, and she didn't seem to be as popular or needed anymore. And then Battlegrounds arrived, and that kind of changed everything, because if you do not have a good Domino counter, you're in for a very bad time. Obviously, since she is 7 years old, there are a ton of Domino counters in the game right now. But the fact still matters. She's a capable attacker that can nuke just about everything if you get good enough RNG. I do personally like to call her Bipolar Bimbo, but it is important to point out that she is a capable attacker in her own right that can be insane in specific fights. And then she is an auto win on defense unless opponent has, a solid answer to her. She is what I would like to call like a very much so earlier iteration of Serpent, just about. Because unless you have a great counter, you will take damage, be that through the crit fails, be that through unavoidable special attack chip damage, I would say, because if you're unlucky, you can't trigger Dex, so you're forced to tank that level 1 projectile. And, you know, there's plenty of other things going on, like any of your abilities potentially failing, and her stuns being shortened when she's lucky, and her potentially purifying bleeds and gaining power from it, and her potentially evading. So she does have like a mix mash of crazy defensive abilities that seem borderline unfair unless you have just the perfect counter. And that's kind of what the Serpent is, just way worse, right? And she's still absolutely relevant, an absolute must-have staple for any kind of like endgame player, in my opinion. There we go. Spot number 11 is going to go to Silk. And Silk is one of the most satisfying, enjoyable champions to use, for sure. If fight goes right with Silk, AI kind of cooperates with you. There is just about no better feeling when you nuke something down straight at level 2. When you just go in, attack, you know, do an intercept, do a few more of those, opponent chooses not to use their special attack. You manage to land a few more intercepts, then, you know, go for a combo into charging heavy, into relic, into charging heavy, into level 2, and dead. That is so good when it works out. The problem with Silk, and the reason why she's not higher, is because plenty of times it doesn't. Obviously, you know, either opponent throws level 1 or they refuse to come in for an intercept. She doesn't really have any AI modifications either, so, you know, there's no taunt active to force them to throw their special attack, or no cowardice active to prevent them from throwing the special attack. There is just about nothing, right? So that's like one of the more annoying things about Silk, because you are at mercy of AI. But even if the AI doesn't cooperate, she still persistently, you know, gets solid to good results in fights. She's by far one of the more offensively capable science champions, one of the science nukes, you could say. That evade is tremendously useful to be able to, you know, kind of like get a safe, free, get out of jail free card, basically, when you get caught with your pants down, dashing in on those special attacks. That is what kind of mitigates her not having AI modification. And it's super useful to, you know, dexing unblockable special attacks that would be absolutely devastating. Obviously, very easy access to a ton of debuffs. That's great. And lots of people do not know that incoming ruptures and slows suffer 90% duration, so you can kind of catch people on defense with that as well. But easy access to slow is great. Unfortunately, it's only 2 seconds, and when opponent is in the corner, still is tremendously helpful. A champion that's designed to be played with a relic, in case you guys are wondering why you're not getting the same results as everybody else, has a, you know, very solid level 2, level 3 rotation, in my opinion, fairly free to use, you know, differently depending on circumstances. Possibly the best incursions champion currently, just because with one of the common hacks you can stun lock opponent indefinitely, basically. And yeah, I do think she absolutely deserves to be here. Let's move on. Kushala, again, one of the more successful additions from 2023, one of the top Mystic champions that answers majority of the Mystic class threats, as well as threats from many different classes. She's quite unique in the way she interacts with MD, the way you do have your like blessings to keep up, but those blessings have more useful effects than a lot of people realize, or than many other champions kind of have in their like main ability sections. For instance, you can modify the AI, making them more aggressive. Blessing of Wisdom is tremendously useful, allowing you to block unblockable attacks and mitigating your block damage. And then obviously we do have access to massive amounts of incinerate damage, large amounts of nullification here as well, and then your access to Soul Bar, which is seemingly becoming more and more important by the day. Solid set of immunities in between her incinerate and bleed immunity. Always brings her own buffs to the fight, so unlike many other Mystic champions that have Nullify in their kit, or in general just, you know, she does better than most Mystics would outside of the Cosmic matchups or matchups where buffs are involved. That's just about it. Obviously, the fact that she's one of the better counters, currently a massive problem in the game, which is Serpent and Thanos possibly as well. is becoming one, and Kushala is great Thanos counter. She just does what we need her to do. Awesome champion. Love her. Spot number 9, I'm going to give it to Red Skull. And the reason why he's up as high, because obviously he does have a ton of defensive value still. Even though just about any new champion coming into the game, any new cosmic buff or champion seems to be designed to specifically smash the guy. But it's still undeniable. Unless you have a great counter, you will be pretty much screwed against Red Skull. And on the flip side, he is more than capable attacker. He does not have the widest variety of matchups, however, he can do some of the most needed matchups well, like Domino, and then some more generic ones as well. He is extremely tanky. He does have ability to effectively go stun immune, which is crazy useful. A very solid, easy to access heal block as well on heavy attack. Fairly unique power control on just your blocked hits, access to shock and unstoppable and auto block and power control. Yeah, also one of the few attack champions that's immune to nullify, fade, seal, and stagger. Unfortunately, that is just from champion effects and not nodes, but still. And yeah, for the most part, I think the best tech champion that we have currently. Very versatile, very easy to use, very capable and powerful. The way more champions should be in the game, in my opinion. There's just very little nonsense going on there. What he has, he does well, and that's okay. Move on to spot number 8, and that is purely because of defense, and that's Enchantress. I spoke in great detail and length about Enchantress in a couple of these ranking series videos already when it came to ranking up 2024 champions and the Mystic class. And ultimately, the short and dry version of that is she's a bitch. She has some of the most useless offensive kit. She does like 50 million things, but 99.9% of the players will just about never use her offensively and will never learn her spells because, you know, she's shit on attack. Even in quote-unquote long-form content where she's designed to do well, you know, there are just far too many champions that do things far easier and better and faster. All that said, she's on this list for her defense, and she kind of embodies a lot of what is wrong with the game, in my opinion. I would 100% tell you guys that the game would be better off without Enchantress in the game, ever. Wish they never made her. And the problem with Enchantress is, even if you do have solid matchups against Enchantress, the fights can still go very wrong, very fast, pretty much to no fault of your own. You're always dependent on RNG, that's one, and what kind of spells and effects those spells are going to have. Like whether you're going to need to punish the heavy attacks, or you're going to need to intercept, or you're going to need to knock her down. Knock her down's fine, unless there's nodes, you know, stopping you from doing that. Punish heavy attack would be fine, unless it would come with a chance to miss. And if you do, you get smacked in the face. You know, and then even if you do have Science Champion that in theory would be just about perfect, you can still get smacked in the face. And then if it lands an intercept, obviously AI can completely ruin your day too. And you have to get rid of these things before she reaches the bar of power, because otherwise she's just going to take damage, and she's going to take very little damage. So that's, you know, a massive RNG aspect, and it's like layers of RNG. It's which spell she's going to roll, it's what kind of AI you're going to get, whether you're going to miss or not. It's just unpleasant feeling fighting Enchantress just about always. Then, never you mind the AI, never you mind the RNG, add in any extra nodes, and she can become just the biggest bitch in the world. There's like any node that increases her power gain, there's going to be like 5 champions that can do that fight well in the entire game. There are so many different node combinations that make her borderline unplayable. Champions like that should not exist. But whatever. So, again, unless you care about Battlegrounds and Alliance War, take her out. Do not even look at her. If you do care about Battlegrounds and Alliance War, she's pretty much a must-have at this point. Swan, Bullseye. Bullseye is fairly similar. Most of what I said about Enchantress at the beginning, I could say about Bullseye. Wish he was never made. I think it's a bullshit design. Where Bullseye, it's kind of in lesser degree, I would say. And so there are more champions and more conditions how you can deal with Bullseye. It will often suck, but as long as you're effectively bleed immune, you can take him down, albeit, be delayed by their wades. If you're bleed immune and can counter their wade, then you're going to have much better time. There are just about always more decent specific counters to Bullseye. With the 60 FPS update, it's easier to dex his level 1, or most of it anyways. And he's not as bad overall, but he's more consistently awful. Like, he's more consistently just yuck. The reason why he is higher overall, though, is because he definitely has proved his worth outside of defense as well, just unlike Enchantress. Whether we like to admit it or not, his utility is quite awesome for a skilled champion. Guaranteed crits, access to quick bleed debuffs, debuff purification, ability to bypass miss just flat out of the gate is great, and then ability to bypass evade after level 1. There's that done. And he just seems to be borderline pushed by Kabam offensively as well, even though his damage output's lacking. There's no other way to put it. His damage output is lacking. If he had 30% higher damage, he would be like an amazing champion offensively, but it isn't. He's very sensitive to attack modifiers though, so that's kind of cool. But he's one of the better incursion champions with the right hacks, that can be helpful. He has been one of the more popular champions for Eternity of Pain type of challenges so far, for whatever reason. The fights might take forever, but he does those fights quite well, and that's, a good indicator that there is a lot of good stuff in his kit. Problem with that is obviously that it's lacking in damage, for sure. On a side note, there are obviously more and more Bullseye counters coming out as well, and they do counter Bullseye better than, let's say, Serpent counters so far have been countering Serpent, or Enchantress counters so far have been countering Enchantress, I would say. Still, again, a champion that I'd much rather have not seen join the game. He has not made the game more fun or interesting or enjoyable. And that's not because he's a good defender. I don't mind good defenders. I mind champions that are made like this defender and Enchantress. Right, next up, spot number 6 is going to go to Mr. Sinister. One of the best mutant champions in the game. One of the best buffs in the game just about ever. And fairly simple rotation, which I absolutely love about him. The one thing that I really hate, two things that I hate about Mr. Sinister. Number one is his special attack 2 is useless. Like, it really is. Like, if you get pushed to special attack 2, you immediately go like, you really didn't want that to happen. Effectively, only his level 1 is important, which can be a good and bad thing. But, that is one thing that kind of shows that he's an older buff. His level 2 and 3 are the special attacks you just never ever want to use. Kabam should have made these better. They really, really should have. That said, obviously, parry heavy, charge your heavy, build up your bleeds, throw them at opponent. The other thing that I don't like, again, is at a time when Kabam is completely screwing up over all the masteries, and Mr. Sinister buff came out at a time thereabouts when Patriot got released, who has the ability to effectively, reduce the effects of inequity by a large portion. His damage gets gutted by inequity mastery. In other words, if there's no inequity mastery involved, he's actually a really high damage output champion. If inequity is involved, he's significantly slower. He's not unplayable, but he is significantly slower. All that said, very good champion all around. Crazy good defender if opponent does not have the right counter again, unless they can effectively heal block him or go on without crits and can't prevent his regen. He's a very, very good defender. Also because they are forced into very bad choices facing Mr. Sinister, because unless you're using a robot, you can't let him spam level 1s in most scenarios because you're going to be taking degen damage. You don't really want to bait out the level 2s either too much because you get 100% concussion on you for 6 seconds. and then you just effectively kind of have to wait it out for most part. So that slows you down too. One point to mention, his awakened ability is much more useful than people realize. It is super important, and just about everywhere, aside from Battlegrounds maybe, but even sometimes in Battlegrounds, 6-star, rank 6, awakened, high 6 Sinister is going to be better than unawakened 7-star. You do want this sig ability, you do want to get quite lucky with it in the, Battlegrounds type scenarios to get the best of it, obviously. But in questing scenarios, super important. So stuff like Necropolis, stuff like incursions, general questing, very important to have this ability. And even in Battlegrounds, it can make him a completely different defender. If he gets a couple of combat power rates, for instance, he, gets much harder to play against often. If he gets a couple of the Cosmics, Furies, offensively, he becomes much faster. So there are mixed and varied results, which I do not love. Another thing about Mr. Sinister that I like a lot is that he does have quite a lot of quirky utility. So he's immune to taunt and reverse controls, becoming more and more significant. He's pseudo-immune to bleed, or takes 100% less bleed damage. He can block unblockable special attacks, except against tech champions. And all of that stuff is quite cool. You can also deal with skill champion Purify. So yeah, Mr. Sinister, one of the best champions in the game at the moment, in my opinion. So on spot number 5, I'm going to give it to Thanos. And this is kind of a provisional pick. You can hate me for it, you can love me for it, you can say Thanos is the best champion in the game, or you can say Thanos shouldn't be here yet. I think one thing's clear, there's a lot in Thanos' kit going on. He does have defensive value, he does have solid amount of damage and solid amount of utility. Now I do have issues with Thanos at times, and I will be making a video about it, the things that I like and do not like about him. At the moment, we're actually seeing a very gimped version of Thanos, because every tactic attacker has access to slow to bypass the unstoppables, which is going to be a big problem dealing with him. And offensively, we're also not able to necessarily use the best rotation for Thanos because of the necessity for the debuffs early on, unless you're going up against the tactic defenders. Overall, I definitely see a ton of potential. He does have a ridiculous amount of abilities and utility. His increased combat power rate is, great as a defender and attacker to have. His unstoppables, again, great offensively with your counter punching, effectively getting guaranteed intercepts. That's very solid. Defensively, that can be a major hindrance and is a point that you absolutely have to address and, deal with. He does have access to plenty of buffs. As a Cosmic Champion, he has access to plenty of debuffs and a unique dot that is, again, super useful. He also has access to Armor Shatter and Pulverize that lets you deal with just about any tech champion and their armor ups. You can pause them pretty much indefinitely. He has access to easy knockdowns with that passive heavy attack too. Passive stun on the heavy attack chain. And he does have access to Panic, which stops opponents from evading or causing your attacks to miss. And that's before we start talking about his immunity to Cold Snap, Frostbite, and Poison. And yeah, he's very, very, very potent. Offensively, defensively. Still can't place him at the very top because he's brand new to the game. We do need to see how well or poorly he does over a longer period of time. So far, he has made a very good impression as borderline must-have champion in the game. He's kind of like that brand new toy that everybody wants to play with, and a lot of people have him because you can, earn him in a guaranteed way. And I do see a future where his standing and role in the game just increases. Just like I can see a future where, he doesn't do that well. Even though I'm leaning more in the camp of he's probably going to do very well in the game. Right, let's move on. Spot number 4, I'm going to give it to Chavez at the moment, just by the sheer nature of the fact that overall, from all the 7-star champions they have, she has probably done the most for me. She works ridiculous amount of time. She's great for a ton of matchups Mystic champions wouldn't be. She has arguably better power control than any other champion in the game in specific situations, just like kind of Warlock, but it works, different when ability power gain is involved, and that has been absolutely massive. She has great damage output, she has healing, she can make opponents' furies completely useless and pointless and actually have them reduce the attack. She has ridiculous amount of power gain, spamming heavy attacks, spamming and access to that passive stun. She's unseemingly huge success story in MCOC. Like one of the best Serpent counters, obviously, and again has very high amount of matchups and node combinations where she just works and is great. Has solid defensive value as well, where the fights can go very wrong very quickly. And obviously she's not the defensive Juggernaut some of the other champions on this list are, but hey man, she's great. There's just very little else to say about it. Has value in a ton of different game modes, as an Alliance War Defender, as an Alliance War Attacker, as a Battlegrounds Attacker, a bit less, but also as a Battlegrounds Defender. It's great for questing, it's great for plenty of challenge type stuff content. She was useful in Necropolis as well, in the initial runs, and as well for the challenges. And yeah, I can genuinely say out of all the 7-star champions that I have and have ranked up and have invested in, she has by far done the most to earn back that love and those catalysts. So, who are the top 3 then? In spot number 3, I'm gonna put Photon. I still think Photon's criminally underrated offensively, just because she doesn't, nuke every fight in 35 seconds or 40. But even for Battleground standard, she can be plenty capable to finish out even massive helpful fights in like 60 seconds. But the way she does it is part of her charm, because she's extremely safe, she's extremely tanky, there are plenty of fail-safe, she does have access to taunt. You do not really need to be worried about opponent, parrying you by accident, because then she goes invisible and you can utilize that to ramp up faster. In specific metas, she ramps up ridiculously fast as well. And then there's obviously the defensive value of her, where unlike Serpent and Bullseye and Enchantress, you can predictably deal with her using just about any or most of the champions. The question is of how well or how compatible those champions are, but you can take a mediocre champion and you can do Photon fight just on pure skill alone. That I can kind of respect. The one thing that goes against it is, switching off willpower, which I still really dislike and disagree with, but it doesn't, impede the fight as much as, giving unblockable special attacks on your, decks and stuff like that, so whatever. She's one of the toughest defenders in the game. She's nowhere near as defensively dominant as she used to be when she arrived initially, but she is good enough defender for her to be one of the 5 best defenders in the game. Just about every meta, even if she's useless offensively, you still see her in the decks just because of the defense. And then obviously, she is an absolute definition of a dual threat. She has a ton of utility in between her debuffs, in between her passive Petrify that lets you mitigate Mystic Dispersion, a ton of regen in between Despair and that Petrify. Then, her access to energy attacks, so, she can even deal with stuff like Korg, for instance. Her safeguards, access to taunt, ability to bypass miss, immunity to neutralize. Don't know what else to say about Photon. She is one of the 3 best champions in the game, one of the 3, 4, 5 best options to take to rank 4 as 7-star as well, in my opinion. Let's move on. Serpent. And Serpent is so much higher than Bullseye and Enchantress for one main reason only. Serpent's actually an offensive Juggernaut too. Except for Battlegrounds. Just about anywhere and everywhere else, Serpent's actually crazy good attacker. Problem with Serpent is, he's ramp-uppy, he's slow, and that by definition puts limit on him. And there's specific situations in pinch scenarios, Serpent can be competent enough attacker in battlegrounds to finishing up fights in like 60 seconds, 80 seconds, something like that. But that's obviously not fast enough for him to compete with the nukes. The reason why we don't see more people use Serpent on attack outside in battlegrounds is because he has just too much defensive value, really. Because even with Kabam making bang on selling Serpent counters, very few of those counters are kind of good enough. And Serpent's still often a viable throwdown on defense, even if opponent has counter. In current meta and many others before that, Serpent's borderline win condition. Like, I think only times I have won against Serpent in this meta is when opponent had like completely undoable matchup, or they were fighting a Serpent themselves. And by like completely undoable matchup, I mean like somebody that wasn't immune to anything going up against Mantis in Science Class or something, whilst they were using Science Class. As in like just like no chance scenario. In general, Serpent's just brutal on defense. Obviously, again, there are champions that deal with Serpent on defense, and Kabam's going to sell more and more counters, and eventually his defensive value could potentially reduce. But he's much more in the camp of Domino, where even all this year, even all these counters, and I firmly believe that Kabam could make like 20 more counters as long as they do not completely nuke Serpent. It will not even matter much, because unless opponent has one of those counters, it's just immediate, loss. And then even if they do have those counters, because of how tanky he is and the amount of health he has, he still have a solid chance to win that round. And then on top of everything else, aside from Serpent being the biggest dick on defense, again, awful design, by the way. I wish the defensive kit of Serpent didn't exist in the game, or not in its current form anyways. He's a powerhouse offensively. He was one of my MVPs for Act 9.1 and 8.4. He can be absolute powerhouse in incursions. He is one of the MVPs for a lot of Eternity of Pain type content. Like, even right now, when we have the Autumn of Agony Gauntlet, he just solos the entire path. All of the fights. Like, all of them. On the right side. You can take him in against Jabari, you can take him in against Cassie, you can take him in against Heimdall and Northstar. He's going to do them all. It's quite ridiculous. That, in itself should serve as a proof that he's very competent attacker. Just not in battlegrounds necessarily. We had the hashtag Gods Challenge, which was largely made to be one of the easiest of the new Necropolis Korean challenges because of this guy. Because he's tremendously powerful attacker in Necropolis. Very easy to use, very safe, solid amount of damage. There you go. Works for a ton of fights. And he's a champion that just reached OP in design choice. Really does. Like, because he has like 50 million defensive abilities and also plenty of offensive abilities. He's immune to death. Like, okay, he has the immortality mechanic, obviously. But he has so many immunities and resistances. So during opponent's special attacks, he's immune to stun. Then grants immunity to Power Lock, Special Lock, Heal Block, Fate Seal. Prevents his ability rate from being reduced below 50%. Immunity to Cold Snap. Reduce incoming bleed effects by 90%. Combat power rate is reduced by 30%, cannot be reduced further, and he reduces the potency of incoming power drain and burn effect by 60%. So power drain and burn is significantly less effect. And the strategy he has, obviously, his power gain. Automatically will apply fear debuff, switching off unblockable, removing perfect block chance. Then he has the true focus that stops your evades and miss mechanics. And he has pierce for extra block damage. He has very large health pool. He has block penetration, crit resistance. He has built-in armor. It's just a lot, okay? But it's perfectly balanced, allegedly. As balanced as the leader is in the game. So I wonder why the leader isn't in this top list. Maybe some champions are more balanced than the others. Right. Ultimately, that's Serpent. If you want to be competitive in the game, it's borderline a must-have champion. There's just no way to say it. Like, if you play it very casually, you can probably do without Serpent. You know, you're not going to miss him that much. There are plenty of other questing champions and so on and so forth. If you want to play your Battlegrounds, if you want to play your Alliance Wars, you must have this guy. And even without that, he's just still very good to have for the Korean challenges, for story content, for potentially Necropolis, for just about any game mode. He works offensively as well. So, there we go. The best champion in the game is no other than Onslaught. And I was up and down on Onslaught. Initially, obviously, I thought he's absolutely OP. Then people were kind of like a bit down on him offensively. You know, naming him a bit too tricky to use or a bit too slow. And then when he was one of the Summer of Suffering fights, you know, people got better at fighting him. But ultimately, none of it really matters. He's just awful to fight against and awesome to use. He answers a ridiculous amount of crazy matchups very well. And then he can do even the hardest fights in the game somewhat well. Like in most cases, you can still kind of use Onslaught, for instance, to deal with Serpent. It's not going to be the best time, but the fight's doable. Probably going to lose the round though, but you know what I mean. Like, you're going to use Onslaught to kill a Maestro fairly easily. You're probably going to take some damage from the Maestro's aura for cosmic radiation. But he can do Maestro very well too. Is just the way he delivers his damage, the amount of, again, immunities, resistances, tremendously useful abilities that he has, it just adds up. And ultimately, the reason why I put him up here is that I don't remember a meta or a season or a piece of content where he wasn't amazing. And that's the big difference. Like, I do think, obviously, you know, specifically on defense, in some of the meta Serpents, let's say, better defend. Let's say on attack, you know, Silk or Sinister or Photon or, you know, plenty of other champions can potentially be the better attackers. The thing is, Onslaught he's like always one of the best, even in situations when he's not meant to be particularly good. Like right now, you know, we have a ton of pseudo-immune champions, Incinerate, Poison, wow. But Onslaught is just one of the best attackers in the meta, to the point where I frequently ban Onslaught even if I have it rank 3 myself, just because I'm getting tired of getting wrecked by him, just because all of a sudden he does all the, you know, whenever opponent drafts an Onslaught, half my defenders are borderline useless. That's kind of the feeling, you know, you draft a Korg, opponent gets Onslaught, Korg's useless. You draft an Atum, opponent gets Onslaught, you know, it's useless. And then Onslaught, again, as I mentioned before, can do Thanos in this meta or probably in most of the future ones as well. Then Onslaught can do random Maestros and weird champions from every classes. You know, obviously he's destroying the entire skill class too. And so he's one of the most versatile attackers that we have. And then as a defender, he's absolutely a threat. In between the node combinations, in between the AI, in between his own abilities, is a big, big problem. Right, so let's go a bit more into the detail. So he takes no damage from Bleed, Incinerate, and Shock. He goes Super Saiyan mode and gets supercharged if he takes any energy dot, like Cold Snap, Incinerate, or Energy, Incinerate, Shock, or Cold Snap. So you don't want to do that to him. And then his first light and medium hits make no contact, neither does his heavy attacks, so he can bypass damage back mechanics, like from Atuma. If personal debuff or the stun from the party master is purified or prevented due to the debuff immunity, re-inflict those as passives. That is so OP, by the way. Obviously, access to Crush, the Daunted, so well-timed blocks inflict infinite Daunted, where your special attacks deal more damage. Whilst this is active, disables the opponent's willpower mastery. Hey, great. In between his large amount of debuffs, he can completely shut down the healing too. He has Neuroshock, which lets you bypass miss. So, you know, all of a sudden he's a competent Photon counter as well. Why not, right? And you can pause all that and then, you know, deal your damage either by Neuroshocks or by degen. You know, ideally the best damage output is via level 2. But still, oh yeah, he uses less power whilst throwing special attack when organic magnetism is active, which is the thing that you get on level 1, reducing opponents' ability accuracy and making their abilities to fail too. So, yeah. I mean, to put it simple, if you have Onslaught, rank up Onslaught. He's great everywhere in the game. And currently the best champion in the game, in my opinion. I think also the best rank 4 option in the game. There you go. That has been the video. God, this 55 minutes. Hey, it's not as bad. 55 minutes for 20 champions. That's not awful. I did try to be fairly quick this time around. Right, so let's get that list up. Number 1, Onslaught. Number 2, Serpent. Number 3, Photon. 4, Chavez. 5, Deathless Thanos. Again, that's kind of provisional placement. 6, Mr. Sinister. 7, Bullseye. 8, Enchantress. 9, Red Skull. 10, Kushala. 11, Silk. 12, Domino. 13, Warlock. Spider-Ham, Shocker, Nefaria, Prowler, Juggernaut, Venom, Starhand, Spider-Man. And that is it for tonight. I will catch you guys soon. Bye. Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the next